What would you do if you awoke on your surfboard in the middle of the ocean with no recollection of how you got there, marooned by water for as far as the eye can see? This was the terrifying scenario Marcus Beale, a San Francisco resident, found himself in back in 2015, floating precariously in dangerous waters with a huge storm on its way. Marcus was to learn what being a survivor really meant.
There were many awful moments, but that first time I woke up on my board, seeing nothing but ocean all around me, my head pounding, my mouth like sandpaper, and my face all tight and tingly from the sunburn. That was one of the worst. I felt a bump, and it must have pulled me out of my unconscious state and brought me round, and that's pretty much when I panicked for the first time. All these questions are raging through my mind. How, why, which way to paddle, where's home? It was just exactly the same view wherever I looked. It was just terrifying.
Marcus was a keen surfer and would often surf the quiet beaches and coves south of San Francisco with his best friend and business partner Brett. But it was always local swells and nothing too ambitious.
We'd just do it for the love of getting in the water, really, and if we were lucky, getting to ride a wave or two. We weren't into big waves or paddling too far out or anything like that. It was, I certainly wasn't good enough for that.
So how did Marcus end up alone, unconscious on his board, hundreds of miles from the shore?
The last thing I remember is going round to Brett's house to give him a ride. We'd sometimes go on these twilight surfs just as the sun sets. It's a beautiful time to be in the ocean. It really is. But that's all I remember. So now I'm panicking again. But it's not for me. It's for Brett. Like if it was a road wave that knocked me out, then and dragged me out, it most likely took him too. So I'm fearing the worst, and I remember shouting his name, and my words were so weak, and my throat so sore, and as in like it must have been the first time I've used my voice in ages. But like how long? Not how long have I actually been out there? All sorts of bad thoughts, like I'm now raging through my mind.
But Brett is nowhere to be seen. All Marcus sees is ocean. If he had got swept out with him, he's most likely dead. Marcus could indeed be the lucky one.
Yeah, I don't feel lucky at that point. It's starting to dawn on me that I'm going to die, and it's going to be slow.
He begins paddling, feeling the need to take control of the situation as best he can. But he's dazed, he's heavily sunburnt and severely dehydrated, which adds to his exhaustion.
I'm just in this blind motion of paddling, literally like my life depends on it. And I noticed then that the ankle leech to my board has been cut. So that's another filling to the shit sandwich I've been served. Basically, I can't come off this board, otherwise I'm losing it. Anyway, I just give it everything, heading in whatever direction my board happens to be pointing in, which is bloody stupid, really. But I'm just doing it until I can't move my arms anymore, and which could have been hours. I'm done. I'm not sure. And then I look up and just see, well, the same view, ocean, without anything in sight other than moving water as a reference point. And let me tell you now, it's impossible to know how fast you're moving, or even if you're moving at all, without a reference point. And that realization was a huge kick in the balls.
He lay there exhausted, thirsty and in pain, before passing out, and only waking when the horizon was cradling the setting sun. Other than the sky, though, the view was exactly the same.
It was a gentle bump again that woke me. I still didn't think anything of it until I felt a harder bump shortly after that one. But this one almost knocked me off the board. And I look down and I see this shark. Not massive, but it's a bull shark. No question about that. And it's sure big enough. And it's circling the board and prodding at it with its nose. And all this is to a backdrop of the sun going down. So I'm thinking, if this is the same shark that woke me that first time round, then it's following me, and I am f***ed. There's no way I'm going to last the night out here.
He sat perfectly still, his movement now completely at the mercy of the ocean and its currents. He watched the sun sink further and further into the horizon, displacing the sky with a rainbow of evening reds, until it was eventually replaced with a rich splattering of starlight. For that hour or two, the shark never ventured more than a few metres from the board, disappearing under the water for a short time, before reappearing again.
The only saving grace was that the sea was so calm that night, as I recalled. There were no real waves, so to speak of, so I felt sturdy enough on the board. Though I knew one big knock from Jaws down there would have sent me flapping. But I just don't think I moved from my fetal position for about three to 4 hours. And then in my exhaustion and semi-consciousness, I guess I must have felt it safe to lay down at some point, often jolting awake, as you do, and then drifting off again. But next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun was beating down on me, and I just felt awful.
The view still hadn't changed for Marcus, as he'd naively hoped it would. It was still ocean all around. The wind had picked up, and although the sea was still calm, it had become slightly choppy. His hunger and thirst was now insufferable, and in a desperate bid to take liquid on, he finally unzipped his wetsuit in an attempt to lick any condensation that had formed on the inside. There were some droplets, but not enough to quench a thirst. But with the wetsuit unzipped, he searched his board's short pockets, and by sheer fortune, discovered a fudge sweet that Brett had given to him that night in his apartment.
Oh, mate, that was a moment. Perhaps the tastiest thing I've ever put in my mouth. A strawberry shortcake fudge. The wrapper said it was from this little sweet shop called Cottage of Sweets in Carmel by the sea. I remember thinking if I ever got out of there, I'd be paying that little sweet shop a visit. And at that point, I was prepared to spend my life savings on strawberry fudge. But what goes up must come down, and it was shortly after that I remember this unsettled feeling wash over me. Not dread or existential. I mean, I was already dealing with that. This was different. It was on top of those existential and dread feelings. But I just couldn't put my finger on it at that time. Anyway, without knowing the cause of it, I had to just let that feeling go. And I thought it's best to ration that fudge, eat half now, and I would be thankful later. But wow, when that sugar hit, I can still taste it.
Marcus knew he had to do something, so in the most rudimental way possible, he tried to navigate which way home might be. He figured that he'd just paddle in the direction of the rising sun.
I know it was basic logic, but I just thought the sun rises behind you when you're on those Frisco beaches in the morning, looking out, and it sets west out to sea in the evening. So I figured where the sun was rising would take me home. I know I'd make no navigator, but I had to paddle in some direction, and that was all I had.
As logic goes, it did make sense, but keeping that setting position fixed was always going to be difficult without other reference points. But even more worrying for Marcus was, unbeknown to him, he drifted nearly 200 miles away from shore with the currents, which was still pushing him out. With no water, only half a sweet and little strength, a difficult task had become almost impossible. His paddling was also quite ineffective. Scared of the shark appearing, he was making efforts not to splash too much, which slowed the movement down even more.
I paddled for hours without stopping, and with nothing to do but think, and usually about how thirsty I was, but I thought a lot about my loved ones, especially Kate, my fiancée. I thought about the life I'd make of myself back in San Fran. I'd been going through a bad patch before all this, and struggling with my mental health, but man, I would have done anything to get back to it at that point. And I suppose I was also mourning Brett, in those hours I was paddling, I was sure he'd perished. Oh man, it was just, the whole thing was just a horrible experience. And on top of this, there was that nagging concern at the back of my mind, and something that just wasn't sitting right with me about something.
Despite his exhaustion and the pain in his arms, Marcus didn't stop. Stopping would mean drifting, perhaps back the way he'd paddled so hard to come from.
I'd made some big decisions on that journey. I made an agreement with myself that, God willing, if Brett was still alive and if I got out there, then I would sell him my share of the business. He was right. Our little tech company didn't mean as much to me as it did to him. My stubbornness and lack of drive was holding him and the company back. So I'd just give him what he'd been asking for. And in the worst case, if he was dead, then I just said it to whoever wanted it. And it was making me miserable, and I could then concentrate on just getting happy. And then I was just fixed on that. I remember that, and that seemed to spur me on, as if like I had a new vision. I had hope, and I just dug in and paddled faster.
But with that splashing came a returning visitor. It was the shark from the day before, and it was hungrier. It circled Marcus and his board.
I mean, there was no doubt it was the same shark. It was working the long game, and it was hunting me. It was terrifying to realise that. It would swim away and then swim up to the board and nudge it in an attempt to knock me off. And that's when I realised how much my floating 7-foot board was the only thing keeping me from being ripped apart. And I just knelt down in the middle of it, and I couldn't lose a muscle.
He remained like that for several hours, the shark disappearing and then reappearing suddenly until the sun had completed its arc and slipped into its setting position for the night. The worst thing was, without paddling, he was drifting, and it was undoing all his efforts of the previous few hours, but he daren't put his hands in the water.
No, because when I did, I'd suddenly see this huge head emerging from the depths, as if it had been fired from a cannon. It had been waiting for me to do that, for me to put my hands in the water. So I just had to concede defeat, and with the sun now down, I wasn't even sure which way it was east anyway. It was a devastating moment, and at times like that, it's hard not to think you're being punished. As in, like, whatever master was up there pulling your strings, he was cutting mine one by one, as if he wanted me to suffer before he cut them all, I guess.
He lay on the board exhausted and looked up at the starry moonlit sky. When he remembered, he still had that half a fudge sweet left.
It tasted like heaven. Though when I looked at that wrapper, the sweet cottage, it brought back that troubling feeling again that I couldn't quite define nor seem to shift. And I know that sounds really dumb. I'm literally floating on a surfboard in the middle of the ocean with a hungry bull shark, certainly. But the name on a sweet wrapper is unsettling me. Anyway, then I just must have passed out. Oh man, that was a terrible night. It felt I woke every few minutes in panic, dreaming I'd fallen into the water, and then interspersed with the dreams was me thinking I was drinking copious amounts of water. But of course, my thirst was never quenched. Oh, it was just torture. And on top of that, there was the sweet wrapper, the sweet cottage, Carmel by the sea. They just kept going round and round and round my head. And then I woke with a jolt in the morning, and it was colder. And just like that, I knew exactly what that unsettled feeling was. The fudge, it was from the same sweet shop that Kate bought me back a box of sweets from, and after her girls' weekend away. She'd gone to Carmel a weekend previous with a friend, so she told me. But Brett's fudge was from the same little sweet shop in Carmel. I mean, I never thought anything about the time, so I never said anything. And because as it happened, he'd gone back to his folks that same weekend. Kate was away, or had he? Yeah. Was he the friend she'd gone away with? But then surely I was reading too much into this based on one small but delicious piece of fudge. She could have maybe bought a box back for him. Wizard, but it would have been weird if she didn't know him, not that. But it was a possibility, I suppose. Or he could have gone to Carmel another time and bought them. Just happened to have gone to the same little unique boutique slit shop. But he wasn't only my business partner, he was my best mate, so I would have known this if he had gone there. That I'm sure. But so I convinced myself I'm being stupid and paranoid and it's wasting precious energy when I should be focused on surviving and getting home. And also, I can tell it's going to be a rough day.
There is good news, and bad for Marcus. A rain cloud breaks over him, and he's able to wet his mouth and take in a tiny amount of water. The bad news is the horizon is thick with darker, moodier clouds. A storm is threatening. With no sign of the shark, he follows his original plan to paddle east, where the sun had risen, and makes it his mission to get as far as he can that day. But despite the pain and exhaustion, he can't help but think about Brett and Kate. The same thought goes round his head. Was something going on between them? As he thought longer and harder, he'd realised there'd been other signs perhaps that he hadn't picked up on at the time, like when he'd found Brett's jumper in his lounge and, on another occasion, his sunglasses. Entirely innocent when you don't suspect a friend, but suspicious when suddenly you do.
The one that troubled me the most was my guitar tuned to drop D. Okay, bear with me here. I came back home after a few days away at a tech conference in LA, a conference Brett didn't want to go to. Anyway, when I return, I pick up my guitar and it's tuned different to a drop D. Basically the top string is tuned to D, not E, as is standard. I always keep it standard tuning, never deviate. But I'd played with Brett since we were at college, and I know he loves to write in a drop D. I asked Kate if he'd been around, not accusingly, it was more curious at that point, and she just denied it. So I just write it off as my mistake. But now I'm not so sure.
As his mood darkens, so does the sky, and with it, the wind churns the sea up, generating larger waves for Marcus's exhausted body to contend with. But he can't stop. He can't allow himself to drift. He keeps going, the water spraying over the side of the board, now soaking him, making it difficult to see anything. Behind him, he can see the eye of the storm, and it's coming his way.
Imagine the darkest clouds, this thick curtain of rain falling from them, and then imagine these flashes of lightning every few seconds, and it's only a mile or two away. It was like something from the horror movie. I could feel its energy, like this haunting hum, and the waves, well, they're getting bigger. So big now I can't actually paddle. I have to focus on staying on the board, so I'm gripping the sides tight as the wave pushes me up and it slams me down. Initially it's from one direction, but as the storm moves in, waves come at me from all directions, lifting me, slamming me, and at this point they're like 6-7 foot waves, but they're every few seconds, and I'm clinging onto my board, clinging on for dear life.
But this was nothing compared to what was about to be unleashed from the eye of the storm. An eye which can be several miles in radius. It is now close, and the sky is so dark Marcus is unsure if the clouds are mimicking night or whether it is evening. Either way, he can't see much as the ocean pummels him hard. The waves become bigger, now 10 to 12 foot, the size of two grown men standing on top of one another, which seems even bigger when you lay flat on a board.
It was just a complete attack on the senses. I couldn't breathe from the water hitting me. On top of that, the noise of the waves crashing around me was, which is deafening. And if not for the flashes of lightning, I probably wouldn't have seen how big the waves were, but they were huge walls of water. sucking me up and then crushing me down. I couldn't imagine hell being much worse.
Marcus was hit by one wave too many. His board flipped and he went crashing into the water. Dunked several times by the waves, unable to come up and catch his breath, his board now gone, he thought the end had come.
I couldn't come up long enough to catch a breath. I'd just get to the surface, and then another wave would come and pummel the out of me and drag me down, and this kept repeating until I found the break in the waves. I'd taken as many breaths as I could and then just waited for the next one to hit, which was never long. And this cycle went on for what felt like hours. And I have this vivid memory of my lungs feeling like they were on fire the whole time. My arms were so weak from fatigue. But I don't know how, but I managed to stay afloat that whole time, and I stayed alive until that beast of a storm passed over me, by which time the sun was rising.
Marcus had to tread water and swim to survive. But there was also the small matter of being in the water with a ravenous bull shark.
I thought about that shark, but you know what? I was just spent. I had nothing left in my tank, and in fact, if I'm being honest there, I just wished to it to come and take me, to drag me down and take me out of that suffering. Because you know what I was saying earlier about a puppet master cutting my strings one by one. Well, it felt losing the board as the last string to be cut, and I was done. Bit like the leash that would have secured that damn board to my leg. Which got me thinking about that leash, actually. And that when I first woke up and realised it being cut, I was just thinking about that was going through my head. And the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed that the cable had been cut clean from whatever impact I'd had. Yeah, I'd been injured when I first woke up on my board those days previous.
Despite treading water in a choppy sea with a possible shark hunting him, Marcus's thoughts are occupied with what had happened to him those few days before, and his conclusion is shocking.
And I can't get the idea out of my head that directed destiny. Look, I know my mind was on the edge of madness with everything that happened to me, but I was completely lucid when I realised this. The last thing I remember is going to his house to pick him up for a surf. I think he drugged me with something that would have knocked me out for a few hours. He drove me in my car to the cove, and remember, it was a twilight surf. It's quiet anyway, but on when it's dark, there would be no one there, no one to see us. He put me on my board, cut the leash, and sailed me out past the breaks out to sea. It was all set up so it looked like an accident. I'm guessing it was hoping I'd fall off the board out at sea and simply drown without a trace. And his motivation, well, I was almost sure he was having an affair with Kate, and he also wanted me out of the business. So that's two big fat reasons right there. The one thing I couldn't figure out, and I didn't really want to, was whether Kate was in on it too. But like I said, I didn't want to think about that. Weirdly, realising this spurred me on. I couldn't sink to my watery grave, thinking this about the two people I loved the most, without proving it, or even better, disproving it. So I swam with what strength I had and followed that storm towards the east. I don't really remember much about that swim, but I remember being in a lot of pain, with barely any strength to keep me from thinking. But eventually it did get to a point where I couldn't do it anymore. My mind was still willing, but my body just couldn't. I'd sink, taking a huge mouthful of water, but then just managed to pull myself to the surface before fully drowning. And then it would be sink and repeat over and over. And I was just waiting for that last one where I wouldn't surface. But then I saw something.
50 metres ahead was something quite extraordinary. A large buoy floated, set up temporarily by the marine biology department of a local Californian university to measure the impact on the sea from ocean storms. By a stroke of well-deserved fortune, the storm had pushed Marcus several miles east, back towards land, and although the buoy was still anchored 20 miles from shore, it meant he was closer to it, and with it, a means of buoyancy.
I thought it was a mirage at first, but as I used my last bit of energy to swim to it, to my utter joy, I realised it was as real as you sitting there, and I would have probably cried if I had any moisture left in me.
The buoy was about 1 metre squared, with a little foothold on it, enough to climb aboard it, but Marcus had no strength to climb, and simply wrapped his arms around a metal grip to keep himself afloat. He then passed out.
I woke up to the sun rising, and the sound of a boat, or the engine of a boat nearby. But I couldn't even raise my arms to signal it. There's nothing. I just had no energy, no strength in them. And then the horror hit that my one chance of survival was about to pass me by, and then that was awful.
But Marcus needn't have worried. The university's poor fortune turned out good for him. Their wave buoy had malfunctioned as a result of the storm the day before and not recorded the data they needed. So in an attempt to fix it, a small team were sent out to it that morning. As they approached the buoy, they saw Marcus clinging to it.
I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. At first it looked like a pile of debris that had lodged against the buoy, which I thought was probably the reason it wasn't working. But then as I went to untangle it, I realized it was a man. I almost fell in the water with shock. I just couldn't believe it. We were miles from land, in the middle of the ocean, to me it seemed anyway, and there's this guy in a wetsuit clinging onto our device. He looked dead. Then I hear him murmur, "Thank God," and he was repeating the same thing over and over. I mean, he was alive, but fully out of it. Like, fully. We just grabbed him and put him in the boat.
The word he repeated over and over was Brett. They drove him back to land, where he was transferred to Zuckerberg General Hospital and treated for severe dehydration, sunburn, and exhaustion. He stayed 2 weeks and was then discharged with a clean bill of health. Miraculously, he suffered no long-term damage. But what about Brett and Kate? He found out later that he hadn't been reported missing to the police until around lunchtime the day after going around to Brett's house, when Kate and Brett filled out a joint missing persons report.
And that told me everything I needed to know. I guess they'd left it long enough so any search and rescue party would never find me. The report said that I'd gone out for a surf on my own on that morning, which was utter bull. I never went out on my own, and I remember going to pick Brett up the night before. So, I knew what the truth was, and I never returned to mine and Kate's apartment, and instead went straight to the police and told them everything.
Kate and Brett were both arrested, but without proof as well as an inconclusive toxicology report on Marcus, the charges were eventually dropped, and they were freed.
Well, surprise, Brett and Kate got together shortly after all this happened and married, so I was right about that. And as for the attempted murder, I'll prove it one day. I can wait. That time in the ocean has taught me how I can be patient and resilient, so I'm not worried about that. Oh, but the one good thing to come from all this is discovering those strawberry fudges from that little sweet shop in Carmel by the Sea. And in fact, of a delivery of them coming this very evening.